take that as a yes. Okay, welcome to this session. It's from a very chilly but sunny UK at the moment. So I think this session is just to run through sort of data privacy, data protection, global regulations, more of the challenges around how we, as a society, try and manage these items. So a little bit about me. I think I've done 2 of these. I think this is my 3rd one of these for iExperts, which is a great privilege always to be asked back. But a bit about me, I've got, well, actually 35 years working across those industries, mainly business and technology change, although it's nearer 38 years these days than 37, so 35, I mean. I've published several books on change management, technology, financial service, etc. And I'm a non-executive director, board advisor for some various firms, everything from performing arts to education technology and gambling awareness. I've mentored many people, probably getting on to about 40 now, I guess, on various items around the globe. And also, last but not least, I'm an associate lecturer for the Open University, and also got an MBA from the Open University. So that's me in about 90 seconds. I think before we sort of dive into the crux of the presentation, it's probably worthwhile if I just do a little bit of background on the background to this and why we think global and data protection is required. So cut long story short is, again, appreciate some of these items are quite basic, but I think it's worthwhile running through them depending on the people who are attending. Everything is digitized, runs on technology, whether that's news, banking, social media, shopping, etc., etc. Data, you need data and lots of data to operate, and excuse me, and that data needs to be sort of timely, accurate, and used appropriately. There's various different types of data, whether it's unstructured data, structured data, hybrids, which most data is, to be honest with you. There's lots of data you could say are facts, some of it as opinions. Unfortunately, some opinions are portrayed as facts, but that's a different debate under different things. And there's lots of data created on other data. So it's a real sort of spaghetti of stuff. There's different levels of sensitivity. There's public data available, which you can go on BBC's and CNN's and various news sites, Bloomberg, to get data. And that's tend to be reasonably public available. You've got corporate data such as financial records, customer records, trade secrets, which is very specific to the organisation in appropriate, and which is most of the discussion about today is about personal data, i.e. data that can be used to identify an individual. So that could be personal details, medical records, postcodes, bank account details, addresses. Again, there's so much data out there. It's actually exciting and terrifying in both manners. So the importance of data, so you have the misuse of data is a key risk, to individuals. So if my personal details or anybody's personal details are out there on the web, then it's a big worry. Corporates, if trade secrets are issued, that's a big thing. Should say governments, not governances. Governments have trade secrets, or this sort of leak with the WhatsApp over the weekend regarding the potential American bomb in Yemen. That gets out there, and it creates lots of worries and risks. So therefore, what basically society, firms, individuals, organisations have to have processes and systems and regulations in place to try and ensure that data is used correctly, it's timely, as in it's delivered when it needs to be delivered, it's accurate when it's delivered, so it's protected, i.e. only people who should see it needs to see it, and it's only used, and it's secure, as well as obviously used for the purpose it's needed to be. Sorry about that, I pressed the wrong button and muted myself, I do apologise. So therefore, moving on, this obviously you've put all these processes and controls in place. It protects people, protects companies, protects individuals, society, etc. And one of the big things, it creates confidence. Confidence is one of those fantastic things. It takes forever and ever to create, but can actually be lost within seconds. And just to stress this point a little bit more, there is lots and lots of data scandals, and this was actually just done by a simple Google search. There's no science behind it. And it's these data scandals with data being leaked, not being protected, being stolen or misused, destroys trust. I say erodes trust, it actually destroys trust, and it's forced policymakers to make legislation and regulation. And just run through some worked examples. For those that's just about 6-7 years ago now. It was Cambridge Analytica, which is a firm not far from where I'm at the moment, misused Facebook data, and then effectively used it for what the people didn't know what it was being used for. So effectively, this is a case of misuse. Data breach, again, this is going back a few years. I mean, 147 million, which is almost a number you can't imagine. Credit card details were stolen. So people had their credit cards out there in the internet somewhere, the dark web, and there's obviously challenges around those credit cards going to be misused and sold. Yahoo data breach, where 3 billion accounts were compromised in emails. And actually, to be honest with you, I remember this because I actually had a Google. Well, I'd had a Google Mail account there, which I immediately closed and never used Yahoo ever again. Other items, hotel data breach, again very similar to the bank one before. Guest records, passport numbers, payment infos, stolen, and obviously a significant fine there, and reputational damage and lawsuits could be all but the more important thing is people's passports are out there. People know about the details. They can clone them. They can steal their identity. Capital One, another bank, again very similar. Credit card details were stolen, etc. So credit card details and other personal details are out there. Data leak. Again, biometric details went out there for 1.1 billion people, which you think about it, that is like 1 in 7 people, 1 in 6 people in the whole world, which is terrifying, really. And they exposed financial and personal details again. So that basically means 1.1 billion people could have their ID stolen. And target data breach, again, a little bit same these things. Hackers stole 40 million credit card details. Again, people can have their credit card stolen. Data breach, again, from Uber, similar sort of thing. I won't go through it in too much detail, but samey. T-Mobile data, again, I remember that was very big in the UK. As you can see, their social service numbers were stolen, 37 million people, which is like the population of Australia plus a bit. And British Airways, and again, I remember that, having my details on there as well. So we had credit card details stolen there, and obviously I had to close credit cards and reopen new credit cards to ensure that they weren't used. And there's many other items that don't have high profile. There's notorious stories, discs that were left on trains, printouts that are accidentally sent to the wrong person. I've worked at places where somebody's actually printed out a list of people's personal salaries details onto a printer in the building, and they couldn't remember which printer they printed it on. So all these sort of like challenges you have here. Documents being emailed to the wrong person accidentally, and obviously the one that's sort of bouncing around at the moment is somebody was accidentally included on a WhatsApp message about a state classified data bombing attack by the US government. So again, all these stuff, while they're all slightly different, they all basically say is that the importance is that data that you need to ensure that your data is held, looked after, and used appropriately. So effectively, looking at this in sort of like 4 main areas now is the first one is what are policymakers, which is a posh word for governments, doing about it. On that, then we'll maybe look at where we are with the regulatory themes, because the good thing about it, even though there's lots of different legislations out there, they all have a number of very similar regulatory themes on it. What are the challenges complying with these things? And basically moving on to the fourth bit, which is how these challenges can be met. So looking at the first one, different policymakers, so different parts of the globe have implemented different regulation, and there's lots of it, absolutely buckets of the stuff. If you're a data protection lawyer or a data lawyer, you've got a job forever. The challenge is that different jurisdictions have different rules. So the UK has different rules from Europe. Europe have different rules from different parts of the US, who have different rules to India, different rules to Pakistan, who have different rules to Australia, and so on. I mean, just looking at some of these laws, and some of this stuff is fairly new, actually. If you can look at that, you've got Europe, you've got GDPR, which was the main European regulation. Since the total disaster of Brexit, being from the UK myself, UK have got the UK Data Protection Act, which is effectively GDPR UK, but there are subtle differences between the two. You have Swiss data law, various items in North America. You can see the California Consumer Privacy Act, which is a very, very tough act to follow. The Virginia Consumer Data Act, Quebec, Canada, Latin America. You've got Brazil, the top one there, Argentina. Moving further down, you've got Asia Pacific. You've got Singapore. You've got China, Japan, India. Again, I won't go through all these in every bit of detail. Australian Privacy Act. You've got Middle East. You've got South Africa's not Middle East for some reason. Not sure why I put that in there, but the point is the same, that South Africa got their own regulation. Again, it's fairly new. You've got UAE data regulation. Again, it's fairly new. And Saudi have got data, which is only a couple of years old. So basically what that means is, there are also various other regulations out there as well. So where there's all these data protection, a lot of industry themselves have various rules and pieces of work they need to follow about. Again, I primarily work in financial services. So there's lots of the UK financial regulator, the US financial regulator, the Luxembourg, the German, the French have their own further data protection laws on it. So if you can imagine, you've got layer, it's like a great big lasagna with layer after layer after layer of data. These rules are constantly being reviewed because obviously you notice some of those dates are fairly new. They're being tested in court. Sometimes laws may not pass the basket, and they're updated and so on. So therefore, it is a full-time job just keeping up with regulations. A lot of firms will have dedicated data management teams, data oversight teams, data privacy teams dotted around the globe in their offices just to try and keep on top of what the hell is going on. So basically, sort of finishing on what the policymakers are doing, they have done, obviously, as I noted there, there's a number of common, lots and lots of new regulatory information coming out. Some of it's fairly mature, like GDPR has been around a few years, and some of it, like the rules in Saudi and the UK privacy laws, they're fairly new. So you've got all this stuff all laid on top of each other with different levels of maturity. So what are the common regulatory themes? While there are different rules, one of the saving graces is there's quite a lot of overlap and common themes between them all, which is some good news. I mean, again, just to run through the high level points, the first one in there, the most common rule is to try and protect individual privacy. Make sure that your name, your addresses, your postcodes, your financial details aren't stolen or protected and secured in various different ways. Obviously having protection around technology and user access and all great stuff like that. The idea is also to pretend there's not misuses and breaches. So effectively, if there's any leaks, as I mentioned on the early slide, lots of credit cards being lost, that the organisations have put measures in place to prevent hacks and issues happening along those lines. The other area around there is particularly around individual control over their data, and this is actually quite a good one. Why it's an absolute pain in the backside is actually very, very good. You have many laws like GDPR and the CCPA, which is actually on the west coast of America, the sunny state of California. It grants individuals to access, delete their own personal data. So, if some organization has data on you, you can actually ask for it to be removed or deleted. And also it prevents companies from collecting data and using it without consent, hence the argument about Cambridge Analytica mentioned earlier. Also regulates how the data is actually used. So all these rules, again, while they're all slightly different across the globe, they have sort of a common theme that establishes guidelines for data collection, processes, and storage. It installs accountability and transparency. So what this basically means is years ago, many years ago, is that when there was a senior role for data, there was no individual person, as in Mr. Smith or Mrs. Jones, in charge of that data. So if there was anything went wrong, the organisation was attacked, not the individual. But now they've actually made a lot of these regulations make individual people responsible for this. So if things go wrong, as well as the organisation being attacked or being sued or being prosecuted, individuals can be prosecuted as well. And there's nothing like having the threat of a prison sentence hanging over your neck to do your job properly. This is also an interesting one as well, is the sort of facilitate sort of like cross-border data transfers. Global trade, again, I work in financial services, relies on data sharing. So basically what you really need to do is ensure that when you share data, say from the UK, like for example, I work in London primarily, data shared from London in the UK, say with Paris for trading or customer details, or to the US or to Australia, is it ensures that when the data moves from, say, a regulation that's covered by GDPR to a regulation that's covered by I don't know, CCPA in California, is that the regulations of equivalence. So you're sending the data to a regulatory area that is actually covered. Sports trust, again, this is not so much a principle or a theme, it's more of a fact, is if people don't trust stuff, they don't use it. If you don't trust your banking details are going to be safe on the internet, or your medical records are going to be safe on your health systems, then people won't use it. And just a few more of these, actually, apologies, a little bit samey. This is always an interesting human rights legislation, which often gets a sort of bad press, particularly in the UK and the US at the moment. Is that fundamental human right is that privacy, people have their right to privacy. I mean, obviously within reason, and it will stop things like mass surveillance and unethical data exploitation. And the idea is, this comes back to the thing is, if you collect data, you've got to be very clear and upfront why you want that data and when you want to use it. Encourages cybersecurity best practices, and I know iExperts do a hell of a stuff on this, far more than I know. And there's various laws, particularly in the UK, I know, and the EU as well. GDPR and the UK data protection is very clear on having organisations to make them liable for implementing cybersecurity procedures. That's not always just technology procedures. It's user access. It's ensuring that people are trained. It's the right processes in place, and people don't misuse data. And the last one here, which is my favourite, I must admit, I'm quite vindictive, is the legal consequences. So basically, there are, maybe the second bullet there, penalties, GDPR fines in particular. They deter reckless data behaviour and promote responsibilities. There's often different elements to this. As I mentioned earlier on, individuals can be prosecuted, firms can be prosecuted and fined, and individuals can go to prison, although I'm not aware of any. But one of the things that actually causes the biggest thing for a lot of big firms is the reputational loss, is that things get published on the press, or there's a press release about, we as the data protection team in London, we have now prosecuted this firm. And it's amazing, and being on the other end of one of those, how much panic it causes with clients, and how many clients actually start leaving you. Okay, so I think we've gone through what the policymakers are doing, which I think is lots of very good regulation, or it doesn't always seem like that, to protect data. And while there's lots of different regulation, there are some common regulatory themes, but this does create a number of challenges. As I mentioned before, multiple countries, multiple jurisdictions, fortunately there isn't too much regulation that completely contradicts each other, but there is still a lot of overlap. I think the first thing is, before you do anything, is to understand what the regulation or the legislation demands. People think they can read legal documents, and I've tried it myself, and I think I can read them. But one thing is, I know that I can't read. I can read them, but I don't understand them. So what I suggest is, if in doubt, get expert advice. I know data lawyers aren't cheap. They charge thousands of pounds, dollars, euros per day, per hour to do it. But if you get expert advice on it, it gives you such moral insight on what's covered, especially if you're across multiple countries. And the other area I would suggest is also work with trade or industry groups. As I mentioned earlier, I've done a lot of work with financial services. So a lot of the work we do is various, in the UK, in Europe, etc. There's a large number of trade or industry groups out there who do support data protection and data laws and best practices and what you should be doing when this happens. Get yourself involved, speak to them. Every problem you have is probably been solved by somebody else. So there's no harm in actually going and speaking to them about it. And there's probably 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I think, or 8, if I can learn to count, challenges complying with the requirements. There's a little bit of overlap from previously, but I think it helps the flow of the conversation. Excuse me, losing my voice. The first one, as I mentioned before, there's one of the challenges is there's lots of variations in legal requirements, diverse laws, different policies. While there is overlap, there is some challenges in ensuring that you don't comply properly. Sorry, you do comply properly. The other point I mentioned earlier on, again, slight repeating earlier, apologies, is cross data transfers, and I don't know why I'm pointing at my screen. You can't see what I'm pointing at, but the first bullet point there, it says GDPR restricts data transfers across outside the EU unless adequate protection is ensured. So you can, so if you're going to set up a client hub, say in a country that hasn't got good data protection, be very careful. Make sure you get legal advice on whether that's possible. And the same with China with the PIPL legislation as well. The next item there is high compliance costs, which basically means it's going to cost you a lot of money. As I mentioned earlier, legal costs, operational costs, audits. You may have to, technology adaptation. Companies have to build data region-specific storages, etc. I mean, going back many years, the idea of the cloud computing is you just dump it in the cloud, and the cloud provider dumps it all around the world, so everything's looked after it. But if that data center for where the cloud pull it is not covered by suitable data protection law, it's in your right to say, don't pull it there, put it somewhere else. Constantly evolving regulations. Again, we sort of covered this earlier on, so apologies, a little bit samey. Frequent updates, as you can see there, and uncertainty in enforcement. Normally in the UK and the US, they love a good court case. So as soon as something comes out, it's straight on the front pages and they're all over you like a rash. But other countries, Brazil and even Mexico to a certain extent, have a delayed enforcement. So you may get in trouble, have a breach, but then you don't know where you stand. Data subject rights management, which is individuals. So individual rights, different regions, GDPR, you have the access to access your data, change it or correct it, delete it and export it, that should read. But CCP have the right to opt out to selling, but limited deletion rights. So again, you need to sort of work out where's the overlap on there along those lines as well. This one here, which is actually often forgotten about, and again, from my personal experience, it's actually probably one of the biggest areas, is that most firms have a series of vendors they work with, whether they're outsourced providers, suppliers, data providers, cloud providers, business process providers. So what you really need to do is that, if, for example, you engage a company in a different part of the country, it should be fine because you're under the same data protection law. If you engage a supplier who's based in another country, you've got to ensure there's sufficient data protection in. You don't really want to be setting up a call center in an area that has no data protection in, and otherwise you're going to get yourself in a lot of trouble, a bad reputation. And you can also argue from the other way around. While you're talking about vendor and third-party compliance, as in suppliers, you can actually almost do things along the lines of in the lines of customers as well. You've got to make sure that your customers, if you've got big B2B business customers, are compliant as well. Difficulties in penalties and enforcement. GDPR fines, can reach 20 mil euros. What's that, about I don't know what that is in dollars actually, about 24 million, $22 million, US dollars that is, or 4% of global revenue. And if you're a big bank or an oil company, that could be hundreds of millions. So it's a serious amounts of money. The other thing is the CCPA penalties are lower, but allow private lawsuits. America's much more an individual privacy suing type culture, so that's much more sort of like fits in with the America culture. And enforcement consistency. Again, it comes down to the fact that even though there's lots of overlap between some of these data protection laws, they are subtly different. Cultures and ethical differences, and this is much more of a vague, wishy-washy item, unfortunately, but like most cultural things, it's critical. I mean, different attitudes. Right down the top there, the EU sees privacy as a fundamental right. You have a right to be kept private, to be kept private. Where US focus on consumer protection, are people being ripped off or abused? And different expectations on data control. China, much more of a centralized economy than other parts of the globe, requires government access to all data. Again, I worked with firms who worked in China and they were very uncomfortable with this. While GDPR accesses users' control, i.e. you only get access to data if you need it. So again, sort of like coming to the end now. So obviously we've covered what the policymakers are doing, obviously, which is lots and lots of regulation. There are a number of common regulatory themes and overlaps, which is very, very good and very, very helpful. But there are some challenges with these regulations, especially if you've got multiple jurisdictions. So therefore, I guess the crux of the thing is, how can these challenges be met, destroyed, mitigated? So therefore, several hints and tips from my years of experience of this is in no particular order. I'm just going to have to move something on that is beg your pardon, I've only got one laptop window open at the moment, so I'm struggling to get everything on the thing. So basically the first one is have a global privacy framework. It sounds obvious. Have something all written down, what your policy is, what policies are general across the globe, what policies are very specific to, your UK office or your French office or your Argentinian office, your Peru office. And also have very, very clear and very senior, ideally a board director, if not the level below, owner of the framework. So it's clear ownership, and this senior person can actually enforce that the policies are followed, or the framework is followed, I mean. The next item there is have ensure that you have some principles, reasons, some assumptions and stuff like that. These should align with the privacy laws. And I mean, again, I've listed a few here, lawlessness, lawfulness, limitation, how long are you going to keep it for, how much data you need to be kept, data minimization, what's the bare minimum you need, how data, make sure it's accurate, how long we're going to keep it for. Obviously you don't want to keep it for, well, you're not allowed to keep it for as long as you want. You just need to keep it how long as you need it for. Make sure it's confidential and its integrity, so it's not secured against unauthorized access, and accountability. And it sort of ties in a bit earlier on I mentioned is, make sure there's senior ownership, plug it into employment contracts. If people if they break the global privacy framework, then they're subject to disciplinary action. Make sure it's into supplier contracts, as I mentioned earlier, it's often forgotten, and make sure it's into customer contracts. The next one is policies. Again, these items are all very similar. Make sure you have clear policies on how things are going to get done in the organization. How do you classify data? Everything from personal, sensitive, confidential, public, along those lines. Ensure that if you're going to take the consent management policy, for example, you've got opt-in at GDPR and opt-out for CCPA, ensure that your policies have it very clear between the different regulations, although the concept's the same, the way it's implemented is slightly different. Data retention, the deletion policy, have a policy on how long you're going to keep the data, what's the minimum, what's the maximum, does it change by different jurisdiction or business unit. Cross data transfer policy, again, I won't go through that, we discussed that a lot. And third party vendor compliance, again, have a policy on what your vendors must have in place, and maybe even your customers, for that to comply. Privacy by security by design, or sorry, privacy and security by design. When you design your systems, whether it's a new technology system, a process system, a new product, or extending a product, a new service, whatever you're doing, include sort of security and data privacy as part of the initial design. It's amazing how many times you get halfway through a project or a new product development and you suddenly think, oh no, I need to add this in. Cue panic, and it's never done properly. Do that quickly. User rights management. If you got down there, if you've got data requests, I've worked at a couple of universities. Occasionally we get requests from students under GDPR, especially if they're not likely to pass their exams, regarding their data access. And then there's a whole processes in place to try and get every single bit of data that touches them on it. So make sure you've got a very, very, very automated and process in place, because if you get a lot of these coming in, it can easily just swamp you. So you want to make it almost part of the BAU process. Incident management, and this is really almost saying that no matter how well you prepare, how well you test, all your policies, principles and governance, and all your design and your user rights, and how wonderful they are, you will have some issues. So therefore, what you need to do is make sure you've got a reactive incident plan that you can swing into action immediately when you have a problem. Obviously you need to understand what the breach is, you need to do any notifications, and the one that's often forgot is a communication plan. How do you manage, tell your users, customers, suppliers, regulators of what's happening and what you're doing about it and how you're going to fix it? And using this WhatsApp challenge with the US government, they obviously didn't have a communication plan, so basically going around there being very aggressive and blaming everybody apart from themselves. So the next item now, so I'm conscious I'm almost running out of time, apologies, is compliance monitoring and audits. Again, even though you've got your processes in place and they're running, periodically, 6 months, a year, depending on what you feel the necessary is, do privacy audits. Is everything still there? Regulatory change monitoring. Have we complied with all the laws? Record keeping, is anything needs to change? Constantly check with your suppliers and your customers. Are they still compliant? Because they may have moved on. They may not be as sophisticated as you are. And finally, well, not finally, penultimately, is the employee training and awareness. Keep ensuring training your employees, make them do training courses, make them aware of contracts, and make them aware of the issues of doing data privacy or lack of it, and also to understand different cultural impacts. You know, I mean, I'm primarily European myself, but different countries do different ways. And European, they tend, or in UK, they take more of a low-key online training lunch session. What other jurisdictions I've worked in and other cultures I've worked in is much more sort of regimented. And monitor, again, this is slightly repeating the points before, but it's worth mentioning, and monitor or regularly monitor legal and regulatory changes. There is no excuse if you fail it. If there's a law's change and you're not compliant, you can't say you didn't know about it. Well, you can, but it won't hold up in court. In instance, there's no excuse. So keep monitoring the market. Only the paranoid survive. And that almost brings me to the end now. Apologies, I've overrun by about a minute, I think. So basically, we've gone through what the policymakers are doing, the common regulatory themes, the challenges of complying with these regulations, how these regulations or these challenges can be met. To summarise, data is key to society. Without it, nothing will work. Data needs to be managed and treated with respect, like any other element. Any misuse could impact society, people, customers, etc. There's a large number of data privacy issues that have caused real harm to people. Policymakers have reacted to this by putting rules and regulations in place, which must be followed, otherwise there's strict penalties. Therefore, organisations must be prepared. Okay, thanks for listening. I hope you found that as useful and as enjoyable as I did preparing for it. But obviously my details are there on the slide there. I've written a couple of books if you're interested. Probably the most appropriate one is around the fintech, emerging fintech book in the middle. But otherwise, I thank you for your time. Please let me know if you've got any questions. Okay, otherwise, can't see any questions. I can't see any chats. All the best. I hopefully speak to you soon.